The entire town laughed when the railroad boss forced a struggling single mother onto the platform and accused her of being a liar. Her young son stood beside her, trembling, clutching an old military medal that had belonged to his late father. Most people saw a poor family about to lose everything. One retired marshal saw something very different. The moment he recognized the medal, the color drained from his face. Because 20 years earlier, that medal had vanished along with a child everyone believed was dead. Chapter 1. Tragedie. Eleanor Carter had learned that hunger made very little noise. It did not arrive like thunder or gunfire. It came quietly, sitting down at the table like an unwanted guest, thinning the soup, shrinking the bread, making a mother cut her own portion smaller while pretending she had eaten earlier. By the winter of 1886, hunger had become familiar inside the little isolated cabin north of Red Willow Crossing. It lived in the flour barrel that showed more wood than meal, in the coffee tin filled mostly with dust, in the cold stove Eleanor fed with twigs because split firewood cost strength she no longer had. Outside, the prairie stretched white and endless beneath a hard January sky. Inside, her 8-year-old son Caleb sat near the hearth with a wool blanket around his shoulders, turning an old military medal between his fingers. He did that whenever he was worried. Eleanor noticed, even when she pretended not to. Mothers noticed everything, especially the things children tried to hide. The medal was brass, worn smooth along the edges, hanging from a faded blue ribbon that had once been fine. Caleb believed it belonged to his father, Daniel Carter, who had died the previous spring beneath a collapsed stable beam after working himself half to death trying to save the farm. Eleanor had let the boy believe that because grief needed something solid to hold, and Daniel had loved Caleb as fiercely as any father could. Yet each time she saw the medal in her son's hands, her heart tightened with a fear she had carried for years. The medal had not truly belonged to Daniel. It had come with Caleb the night Eleanor first held him as an infant, wrapped in a torn cavalry coat with no name except the one whispered by a dying woman at the door. That secret had been buried carefully, not because Eleanor was ashamed of it, but because Daniel had made her promise that if powerful men ever came asking about a lost child and a military medal, she would deny everything until her last breath. For 8 years, nobody had asked. Then Victor Kane arrived. Kane owned half the rail contracts west of Blackstone and enough cattle land to make honest ranchers lower their voices when his name was spoken. He was not the largest man in Red Willow Crossing, but he had a way of standing that made rooms feel smaller. Fine black coat, silver-handled cane, polished boots, dark eyes that measured people the way merchants measured grain. He first came to Eleanor's cabin with 2 riders and a county notice folded inside his glove. He did not remove his hat when she opened the door, and that told her almost everything about him before he spoke. "Mrs. Carter," he said, glancing past her into the cabin where Caleb sat half hidden beside the stove. "Your late husband owed money against this land." Eleanor kept one hand on the doorframe. Daniel paid every note he could. Kane smiled. A touching statement, but not a legal one. He handed her the paper. She read enough to understand the cruelty of it. Foreclosure, debt transfer, railroad expansion rights, 30 days reduced to 10 by court approval. Her eyes lifted from the notice to Kane's face. "The railroad line already runs south of town. My land is worthless to you." His smile did not move. "Then surrendering it should cause you less distress." Behind her, Caleb rose silently. The metal chain slipped from beneath his shirt and caught the winter light. Kane's eyes found it at once. The change was small, so small another person might have missed it, but Eleanor did not. Interest sharpened his face. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. The fear she had buried for 8 years rose cold inside her. Kane's voice softened. "That is a handsome keepsake." Eleanor stepped backward, blocking his view. "It was my husband's." "Was it?" The question hung in the doorway like a knife. Then Kane tipped his hat at last. Not from respect, but from satisfaction. "You have until the end of the week, Mrs. Carter. After that, the land belongs to me." He rode away, but his gaze lingered on the cabin longer than his body did. That night, Eleanor sewed the medal into the lining of Caleb's coat. Caleb asked why, and she told him the clasp was weak. Children often accepted the first answer a mother gave because they wanted to believe she still controlled the world. Eleanor wished she did. The public humiliation came 3 days later. Eleanor had gone into Red Willow Crossing to plead for more time, though pride burned in her throat with every step. She hitched their thin mare near the mercantile and took Caleb with her because leaving him alone at the cabin no longer felt safe. The town was busy that morning. A freight train had come in from the east, covering the platform with travelers, workers, ranch hands, and merchants waiting for parcels. Eleanor hoped to speak quietly with the bank clerk, perhaps the county recorder, perhaps anyone who still believed mercy could sit beside law. Instead, Victor Kane found her first. He stood on the depot platform beside a wealthy ranch owner named Silas Brandt, a broad-bellied man with a fur collar and a laugh that always arrived before kindness could. Kane called her name loudly enough for half the street to turn. "Mrs. Carter, since you have come into town, perhaps we should spare everyone further confusion." Eleanor stopped, one hand closing around Caleb's shoulder. "I came to speak privately." Kane descended the platform steps with the elegant patience of a man who had never been forced to beg. Private debts become public when debtors refuse lawful settlement. A few men chuckled. Others watched with the uncomfortable curiosity of people relieved another family's suffering was not theirs. Kane removed a folded document and held it high. "This woman claims hardship while occupying land legally pledged for railroad purchase. She refuses fair compensation, ignores debt obligations, and hides behind widowhood as though grief cancels contracts." Heat rose into Eleanor's face. "That is not true." Brandt laughed. "Widows always say that before they sign." Caleb stepped forward before she could stop him. "Don't talk to my mother that way." The crowd shifted. Some smiled, some looked away. Kane lowered his eyes to the boy. "And what will you do, son?" Caleb's small hand went to his coat, where the metal lay hidden in the lining. Eleanor caught the movement and gripped his wrist. Too late. Kane saw. His expression changed again. This time the recognition was not well hidden. He leaned closer. "What do you carry there?" Eleanor pulled Caleb behind her. "Nothing." Kane's face hardened. "Then you will not mind showing it. You have no right." "Rights," he said softly, "belong to those who can prove them." Then he turned toward the crowd and raised his voice again. "Remember this moment. When the sheriff removes her from that cabin, she will claim persecution. She will weep. She will say men of business have no hearts. But the truth is simpler. She owes. She refuses. And the law will answer." Laughter moved through part of the crowd, not all of it, but enough. Enough to wound, enough to make Caleb lower his head in shame. Eleanor felt something inside her bend but not break. She took her son's hand and walked away without answering, because answering would have given Kane the spectacle he wanted. Yet as she passed the depot gate, she saw an old man standing near the freight office, still as a fence post in winter. Gray beard, broad shoulders, dark coat worn thin at the cuffs, hat pulled low. A retired marshal. Though Eleanor did not know that yet. Samuel Reed had been waiting for a westbound train and wanting nothing from Red Willow Crossing but departure. Then he saw the boy clutch his coat. He saw the flash of hidden brass where the lining pulled loose. He saw the blue ribbon. His face changed as if a ghost had stepped onto the platform. The medal. That medal. He had last seen it pinned to the uniform of Captain Isaac Wren after the Battle of Ash Creek 20 years earlier, before a child disappeared, before a family shattered, before Samuel Reed laid down his badge because the truth had been buried by men with money and influence. Now the medal hung inside the coat of a widow's son while Victor Kane watched like a man who had finally found what he had been hunting. Eleanor did not notice Samuel Reed following at a distance as she led Caleb back through town. She was too busy keeping herself upright. Humiliation had a physical weight. It pressed between the shoulder blades, tightened the jaw, made the air feel too thin. Caleb said nothing until they reached the mare. Then he whispered, "Mama, did I do wrong?" Eleanor turned so quickly the question nearly broke her. She knelt in the snow and took his face in both hands. "No, you did nothing wrong." "Then why did everyone laugh?" She looked toward the depot platform where Kane still stood speaking with Brandt and several officials. "Because some people laugh when they are afraid to stand." Caleb frowned. "Afraid of him?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes." He looked down at his coat. He wanted the medal. Eleanor's breath caught. "You noticed. I'm not little." That made her smile despite everything. "No, I suppose you are not." The boy touched the hidden seam. Why does he want it? Eleanor could have lied. She had lied before, gently, carefully, always in the name of safety. But something about that morning had changed the shape of fear. Cain had seen enough. He would not stop. Lies would no longer protect Caleb from danger. They would only leave him unprepared for it. Still, she could not tell him everything in a muddy street beside a frightened horse. Because men like Mr. Cain want anything that does not belong to them, she said. Even medals? Especially things that carry a name. Caleb looked up sharply. Whose name? Before Eleanor could answer, a voice behind them said, That is what I would like to know. She turned. The old man from the depot stood a few paces away with his hat in his hands. Up close, he looked even older than he had from a distance, not in weakness but in weariness. His eyes settled briefly on Caleb's coat, then lifted to Eleanor with a kind of sorrow that made her uneasy. I mean no harm, ma'am, he said. My name is Samuel Reed. Eleanor stood and placed herself between him and the boy. I do not know you. No, ma'am. Then keep walking. A faint smile touched his face. Not amusement, respect. A sensible answer. I have had a morning full of men wanting something from me, Samuel nodded. I saw. Then you understand why I have no patience left. Yes, ma'am. He looked toward Caleb again, and this time the boy stared back. Samuel's voice grew quieter. Where did you get that medal? Eleanor felt the whole street narrow around her. It was my husband's. Samuel's expression flickered. Daniel Carter? The fact that he knew Daniel's name frightened her. Yes. No, he said softly. It wasn't. Caleb's hand found his mother's sleeve. Eleanor's voice dropped. You should leave. Samuel did not move. That medal belonged to a man named Isaac Wren. The name struck Eleanor harder than she expected because she had heard it once before, 8 years ago, from a dying woman covered in blood and trail dust, placing an infant in her arms and begging her to hide him. Isaac Wren. Father's legacy. Protect the child. Eleanor forced her face still. I said leave. This time, Samuel listened. He stepped back, but his eyes remained troubled. Mrs. Carter, if Victor Cain recognized that medal, your boy is in danger. He has been in danger since the day he was born. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Samuel heard them. So did Caleb. Eleanor regretted them immediately. The boy looked up at her with confusion, fear, and something worse. The beginning of understanding. Samuel's face grew pale. Then you know. Eleanor tightened her grip on Caleb's shoulder. I know enough to keep my son alive. For how long? The question was not cruel, but it cut. She lifted her chin. As long as God gives me breath. Samuel looked toward the depot, where Cain was no longer smiling. The railroad boss had seen them speaking. His eyes fixed on Samuel Reed with recognition that carried old hatred. Samuel noticed too. He put his hat back on slowly. Then I pray, he gives you a great deal, ma'am. He turned away, but Eleanor knew the damage had already been done. Cain had seen the medal. A retired marshal had recognized it. Caleb had heard a name that did not belong to Daniel Carter. And somewhere beneath all of it, the secret adoption she and Daniel had guarded for 8 years had begun to crack open in the middle of Red Willow Crossing. By the time Eleanor and Caleb returned to the cabin, the sun was sinking behind the hills, and the prairie had turned the color of old iron. She found a notice nailed to the door, not folded, not sealed, nailed, public even in isolation. The foreclosure date had been moved forward, 24 hours. She read it twice while Caleb stood behind her, too quiet. Then she noticed boot prints in the snow near the window. Someone had visited while they were gone. Inside, the cabin looked mostly undisturbed, which frightened her more than disorder would have. Whoever entered had not come for flour, coins, or tools. They had searched carefully. The trunk beneath Daniel's side of the bed sat 1 inch out of place. Eleanor knelt and opened it. The old adoption paper was still there, hidden beneath folded shirts. But the ribbon around it had been moved. Someone had touched it. Someone had nearly found the truth. Her hands began to shake. Caleb stood in the doorway, watching. "Mama," he whispered. "Am I not Daniel Carter's son?" Eleanor closed her eyes. There are moments in a mother's life when silence becomes a betrayal. This was one of them. She turned toward him, heartbreaking, ready to answer the question she had feared for 8 years. Then a gunshot cracked outside. The cabin window shattered behind her. Caleb screamed. Eleanor threw herself over him as glass rained across the floor. Outside, a rider's voice called from the darkness, calm and cruel. "Give us the medal, Mrs. Carter, and the boy may live through the night." Eleanor held her son beneath her as winter wind rushed through the broken window. The secret had found them at last. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The fateful meeting. For several long seconds after the gunshot shattered the cabin window, neither Eleanor nor Caleb moved. Broken glass covered the floorboards, while freezing wind rushed into the room and carried snow across the worn wooden planks. Eleanor threw herself over her son without thinking, shielding him with her own body as another sound echoed outside. Not another gunshot. Hoofbeats, slow, deliberate. Whoever had fired wanted them frightened, not dead. At least not yet. That realization settled heavily inside her chest because fear was often more useful than violence. Fear made people surrender. Fear made them run. Fear made them make mistakes. Eleanor remained on the floor until the hoofbeats finally faded into the darkness. Only then did she help Caleb to his feet. The boy's face had gone pale. His hands shook slightly. Yet his first instinct was not to ask about the gunshot. It was to check the medal hidden inside his coat. The sight nearly broke her heart. 8 years old and already protecting secrets instead of childhood. She pulled him close and promised everything would be fine, though both of them knew she no longer believed it. The rest of the night passed without sleep. Eleanor pushed a table against the broken window and sat beside the stove with Daniel's rifle across her lap while Caleb drifted in and out of uneasy dreams. Several times she caught herself staring at the hidden trunk beneath the bed where old documents remained buried beneath blankets and clothing. Documents she had not touched in years. Documents Daniel had sworn must never be discovered. The secret adoption papers still rested there, hidden exactly where he left them. Yet after seeing Victor Kane recognize the medal and hearing writers threaten her son, she no longer felt certain anything hidden could remain hidden forever. Morning arrived beneath a blanket of gray clouds. Snow covered the prairie. The world looked peaceful from a distance, which somehow made everything feel worse. Eleanor had just finished repairing the stove fire when 3 slow knocks sounded against the cabin door. Her hand immediately tightened around the rifle. Caleb looked up from the table. The knocks came again. Calm. Patient. Not the sound of a man trying to force his way inside. A familiar voice followed. "Mrs. Carter." Eleanor recognized it instantly. Samuel Reed, the retired marshal from town. For several moments, she considered pretending nobody was home. Instead, she opened the door a few inches and found Samuel standing alone beside his horse. Snow rested on his shoulders. His face looked weathered and tired, yet there was something else there too. Concern. Genuine concern. The sort of thing she had seen very little of since Daniel died. "What do you want?" she asked. Samuel glanced toward the patched window before answering. "I saw the damage." Eleanor followed his gaze. "And?" The old marshal looked back at her. "And men don't shoot through windows because of unpaid debts." The statement lingered between them. He was right. They both knew it. Eventually, Eleanor stepped aside. Samuel entered quietly, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. The gesture impressed her more than she expected. Victor Kane had never removed his hat. Small details revealed character. Samuel noticed Caleb immediately. The boy sat at the table watching him carefully. Neither spoke for several moments. Then Samuel looked toward the coat hanging beside the stove, the coat containing the medal. Eleanor noticed the glance. "So did Caleb." "You recognized it yesterday," the boy said. Samuel nodded. "Yes." "How?" The old marshal lowered himself into a chair. For a moment he seemed unsure how much to say. Then he sighed heavily. "Because 20 years ago I spent 6 months looking for the man who owned it." Silence filled the room. Even the crackling fire seemed quieter. Samuel continued. His name was Isaac Wren. Cavalry captain. Decorated veteran. Honest man. The sort of man who made enemies without realizing it. Eleanor listened carefully. Every word felt important. What happened to him? Samuel stared into the fire. Officially, he died during a winter journey. The bitterness in his voice made clear he did not believe it. And unofficially? Eleanor asked. Samuel's eyes lifted. Unofficially, I think he was murdered. Caleb stopped moving entirely. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. Samuel continued speaking slowly, as though walking through old memories. Isaac Wren, his wife, and their young son vanished while traveling across the territory. Weeks later, a few personal belongings were recovered. No bodies. No convincing evidence. Yet powerful men insisted the case be closed. The child was declared dead. The inheritance was transferred. The records were sealed. Samuel objected. Nobody listened. Years passed. Eventually, he retired. The mystery remained unsolved. And the medal? Caleb asked. Samuel looked directly at him. It disappeared the same day the family did. The room grew quiet again. Caleb slowly lowered his eyes. The metal suddenly felt heavier than brass. It felt connected to something larger than any of them understood. Eleanor folded her arms. What does any of this have to do with my son? Samuel hesitated. The pause lasted just long enough to worry her. I don't know. The answer surprised them both. But I know Victor Kane recognized that metal. He leaned forward slightly. And that worries me. Eleanor laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because worry seemed too small a word. A man shot at my cabin. Samuel nodded. Exactly. He looked toward Caleb again. People don't risk murder over keepsakes. The statement settled heavily over the room. Before anyone could respond, a rider appeared outside. Hoofbeats crossed the snow at a reckless pace. Samuel was already moving toward the door when the horse skidded to a stop outside the cabin. Deputy Walter Briggs nearly fell from the saddle. His face looked pale, alarmed. He hurried toward the porch before the horse had fully stopped moving. Samuel opened the door. Walter? The deputy barely caught his breath. Marshal Reed. Samuel grimaced. I haven't worn a badge in years. Then start acting like you have one again. The urgency in the younger man's voice erased any chance of good news. Walter stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Snow melted from his coat onto the floorboards. He looked first at Eleanor, then at Caleb, then finally at Samuel. Kane held a meeting this morning. Samuel frowned. With who? Walter swallowed. Railroad executives, bank representatives, 2 county officials. The old marshal's expression darkened immediately. What were they discussing? Walter hesitated. Then he looked directly at Caleb, the boy. The room became still. Caleb's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Samuel's eyes narrowed. What about him? Walter took a slow breath. Kane called him the missing piece. Nobody spoke. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. Missing piece. Not orphan. Not debtor's son. Not witness. Missing piece. Something important. Something necessary. Something that completed a larger plan. Samuel felt a cold sensation settle in his stomach. He had heard language like that before. Men discussing land deals, inheritances, claims, ownership, pieces of puzzles, never children, never innocent lives. What else? He asked quietly. Walter looked uncomfortable. Kane said if the child reaches 16, everything changes. Eleanor felt her heart stop. Samuel stared. Caleb looked from one adult to another. What changes? The boy's question received only silence because none of them knew the answer. Yet for the first time since seeing the medal, Samuel Reed felt certain of one thing. Victor Kane was not hunting a farm. He was not hunting a widow. He was not even hunting a secret. He was hunting a future. And somehow, for reasons buried 20 years in the past, that future depended entirely on the frightened boy sitting beside the fire. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Refusal. The words spoken by Deputy Walter Briggs lingered inside the Carter cabin long after he rode away. If the child reaches 16, everything changes. Nobody understood exactly what Victor Kane meant, yet the statement settled over the room like a storm cloud refusing to move. Outside, snow drifted across the prairie and gathered against the fence posts, while the isolated cabin stood alone beneath a cold gray sky. Inside, Eleanor Carter moved through the motions of ordinary life, adding wood to the stove, repairing a torn blanket, preparing a simple meal from what little remained in the pantry. But every action felt hollow because her thoughts remained fixed on the same terrifying question. What did Victor Kane know about Caleb that she did not? Across the room, the boy sat quietly at the table, turning the military medal over in his hands. He had always treated it like a keepsake from his father. Now he looked at it differently. Now he looked at it as though it carried answers hidden inside the medal itself. Samuel Reed noticed the change. He noticed everything. That was one reason he had once been a respected marshal. Yet even he could not connect all the pieces. He knew the medal belonged to Isaac Wren. He knew a child vanished 20 years earlier. He knew Victor Kane had become frightened the moment he saw the medal. Most importantly, he knew men willing to threaten a widow and fire through her window were no longer protecting a secret, they were chasing one. The realization disturbed him enough that he remained in the cabin longer than intended. Eventually he stood and reached for his hat. Eleanor looked up immediately. "You're leaving?" she asked. Samuel nodded. Yes. The answer sounded colder than he intended, but experience had taught him that hesitation often became responsibility. Eleanor set down the blanket she had been mending. "You know something." Samuel avoided her eyes. "Not enough. More than I do." He could not deny that. The widow stepped closer. "Then help us." There was no anger in her voice, no accusation, only exhaustion. Somehow that made the request harder to refuse. Samuel looked toward Caleb. The boy stared back at him silently. For a brief moment, Samuel saw another child entirely. A memory. A courthouse yard in Blackstone. A decorated cavalry officer laughing while a small boy chased a wooden hoop across the dirt. 20 years vanished in an instant. Then the memory disappeared. Samuel lowered his gaze. No. The word felt wrong even before it left his mouth. Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. No? Samuel forced himself to continue. I spent years chasing the truth about Isaac Wren. Records disappeared. Witnesses changed their stories. Men with money buried everything. Good people got hurt. He paused before adding the part he hated most. Nothing changed. Eleanor folded her arms tightly. So you walk away? Samuel looked toward the door. I survived because I learned when to walk away. The widow's eyes hardened. And what about us? The question struck harder than he expected. For several seconds he said nothing. Finally, he answered honestly. I don't know. Silence followed. Caleb lowered his eyes. Samuel hated that more than anything. Children expected adults to protect them. Life taught them otherwise soon enough. Without another word, he placed his hat on his head and stepped outside. The cold air hit him immediately. A few moments later, he mounted his horse and rode away from the cabin, determined to leave the past buried where it belonged. At first, the decision felt sensible. The farther he rode from the Carter farm, the more reasons he found to justify it. He was old. He no longer carried a badge. Whatever happened between Isaac Wren, Victor Kane, and the missing child had begun decades earlier. None of it belonged to him anymore. Yet each mile only seemed to make the arguments weaker. By the time he reached the old watering station several miles south of the farm, guilt had already begun following him. Samuel dismounted and tied his horse beside the weathered structure. The place had not changed much over the years. Wind still whistled through the cracked boards. Snow still gathered against the posts. He had stopped there dozens of times during his years as a lawman. As he leaned against one of the supports, something carved into the wood caught his eye. Initials. I. W. Isaac Wren. Samuel stared at them for a long moment. Memory returned immediately. He remembered standing in that exact place beside the cavalry officer years ago. He remembered Isaac warning him that certain businessmen were acquiring land through methods that would never survive public scrutiny. He remembered dismissing the concerns as rumors. Most of all, he remembered the final conversation they shared before Isaac vanished. Samuel had advised him to stop asking questions. Isaac had refused. 2 weeks later, he disappeared. The old Marshal closed his eyes. Some regrets never truly aged, they simply waited. Then he noticed something else. Tracks. Fresh tracks. Several horses. Not travelers. Not ranchers. Riders moving together. Samuel crouched and examined them carefully. 4, perhaps 5 men, heading north, toward the Carter farm. His stomach tightened immediately. The riders were recent, very recent. He could almost measure the hours. For several moments he remained motionless, staring toward the northern horizon. Every instinct told him to continue riding away. He had already made his choice. He owed nobody anything. Yet another thought arrived and refused to leave. What if those riders reached the farm before sunset? What if Cain decided intimidation was no longer enough? What if walking away today created another memory he would carry for the rest of his life? Samuel stood slowly. The answer became obvious the moment he allowed himself to ask the question honestly. He mounted his horse, turned north, and urged the animal into a gallop. Back at the farm, Eleanor spent the afternoon preparing for the possibility of flight. She packed blankets, food, ammunition, and every useful item that could fit into the wagon. Caleb helped quietly. The boy had spoken less with each passing day, as though the weight of unanswered questions pressed against him. Eventually, he stopped folding blankets and looked up at her. "Mama?" Eleanor glanced over. "Yes?" Caleb hesitated. "Am I really Daniel Carter's son?" The question stopped her cold. For a moment, she simply stood there. The truth had always lived in the future. Someday she would explain. Someday he would understand. Someday felt very close now. She sat beside him on the edge of the bed and took his hand. "Daniel loved you." Caleb looked down. "That's not what I asked." The honesty hurt because he deserved it. Eleanor felt tears gathering despite her efforts to stop them. "No," she whispered. "Not by birth." The boy remained silent. "Did my real parents leave me?" Eleanor immediately shook her head. "No." Her voice broke. "Never believe that." Caleb looked confused. "Then why wasn't I with them?" Eleanor remembered the wounded woman. The blood. The fear. The desperate plea. Protect him. Hide him. Save him. Because they were trying to keep you alive. The answer only created more questions. But before either could continue, a sound interrupted them. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses. Eleanor rose instantly. So did Caleb. The rhythm grew louder, closer. She moved toward the window and carefully looked outside. 4 riders stood on the ridge overlooking the farm, watching, waiting. One carried a rifle across his saddle. Another pointed toward the cabin. The message was obvious. They had been found again. Eleanor reached for Daniel's rifle. Her heart pounded. Then she noticed movement farther down the trail. Another rider, alone, riding hard. Snow exploded beneath the horse's hooves as it crossed the prairie at full speed. Even from a distance, she recognized the silhouette. Samuel Reed. The retired marshal had come back. Relief arrived for half a second before reality followed. One aging lawman against 4 armed riders was not a rescue. It was the beginning of a fight. And judging by the way the men on the ridge slowly turned their horses toward him, they understood that perfectly well. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. The detail that changed everything. The 4 riders on the ridge watched Samuel Reed approach with the calm confidence of men who believed numbers alone guaranteed victory. Snow drifted between them and the Carter farm, while the last light of afternoon stretched long shadows across the prairie. Eleanor stood near the cabin window with Daniel's rifle pressed tightly against her shoulder, watching the scene unfold through the frost-covered glass. Caleb stood beside her, silent and tense. Neither spoke. There was nothing useful to say. One wrong move could turn the frozen field outside into a graveyard. Samuel continued riding toward the ridge without slowing. The retired marshal knew exactly what the riders wanted him to see. Their rifles, their numbers, their confidence. He also knew something they did not. Men who relied too heavily on intimidation often grew careless. As he drew closer, one rider urged his horse forward. The man wore a heavy wool coat pulled high against the cold and carried himself with the swagger of someone accustomed to frightening weaker people. "You should have kept riding, old man," he called. Samuel brought his horse to a stop. "You should have stayed home." A few of the riders laughed. The sound echoed briefly across the snow-covered prairie. The lead rider's smile faded. "Mr. Kane doesn't want trouble." Samuel looked toward the rifles. Then he brought the wrong men. The rider's eyes narrowed. "The widow's deadline arrives tomorrow." "I know. The land belongs to Kane." Samuel remained silent. "The boy belongs nowhere." That sentence changed everything. The rider spoke it carelessly, almost absent-mindedly, yet Samuel felt something cold move through him. Most men would have said the boy didn't belong on the property. Most men would have said the boy wasn't Kane's concern. Instead, the rider said he belonged nowhere. The wording felt wrong, dangerous, familiar. Before Samuel could press further, the man tipped his hat mockingly. "Tell the widow to be gone by sunrise." Then the riders turned and disappeared into the growing darkness. They never fired a shot. They didn't need to. The threat had already been delivered. Samuel waited until the last rider vanished beyond the ridge before continuing toward the farm. Eleanor met him outside before he reached the porch. The moment he dismounted, she demanded to know what happened. Samuel repeated the conversation exactly as it occurred. When he reached the final sentence, he noticed the change in her face immediately. She heard it too. The boy belongs nowhere. Not debt. Not land. Not foreclosure. The boy. Victor Kane's attention remained fixed on Caleb. The farm was merely a path leading toward him. The realization frightened Eleanor more than any foreclosure notice. "Why?" she whispered. Samuel looked toward the cabin where Caleb stood watching through the doorway. "That's what I'm trying to understand." For the first time since arriving, he no longer considered leaving. The case had already followed him. Walking away now would change nothing. That evening, the three of them sat around the small table while wind rattled the cabin walls. Samuel carefully examined the military medal beneath the glow of an oil lamp. Earlier, he had only recognized it. Now he studied it. Every scratch, every mark, every imperfection. Caleb watched with growing curiosity. "Have you found something?" The old Marshal turned the medal slowly between his fingers. "Maybe." Eleanor leaned closer. Samuel pointed toward the edge of the brass. This wasn't military work. At first, neither saw what he meant. Then the lamp caught the metal at a different angle. Tiny marks appeared near the rim. Not scratches. Letters. Very small letters. Hidden intentionally. Samuel's pulse quickened. He carried the metal closer to the lamp and narrowed his eyes. Years of age had nearly erased the inscription, but enough remained visible to read. For several moments he simply stared. Then he looked up. Eleanor immediately knew something had changed. "What is it?" Samuel hesitated. The words sounded impossible even inside his own head. "There's a second engraving." Caleb frowned. "What does it say?" The Marshal looked back down at the metal. The letters had been carved by hand rather than stamped by the military. Whoever placed them there wanted the message hidden. Slowly, carefully, Samuel read the inscription aloud. "To my son, if anything happens to me, trust the name hidden beneath yours." Silence followed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The fire crackled softly inside the stove. Outside, the wind continued across the prairie. Yet inside the cabin, everything felt different. Eleanor stared at the metal in disbelief. Caleb looked confused. Samuel felt his heart pounding harder than it had in years. Hidden beneath yours. Not another family, not another owner, another name. The message suggested the child carried a false identity. It suggested Isaac Wren expected his son might one day need protection through another name entirely. Samuel looked toward Caleb. For the first time, the possibility felt real. Not a theory. Not a coincidence. Real. The boy shifted uneasily beneath the attention. "What does it mean?" Samuel answered honestly. "I don't know." The admission frustrated him. Every answer seemed to produce 3 new questions. Yet something about the inscription bothered him even more than its meaning. The handwriting. He had seen it before. Not recently. Long ago. A memory surfaced slowly. A courthouse record. A property transfer. A witness statement connected to Isaac Wren's disappearance. Samuel stood abruptly. Eleanor blinked. What is it? He moved toward his saddlebags. I kept something. Kept what? The old Marshal dug through papers, maps, and worn notebooks until he found a weathered leather journal. Dust covered the binding. The pages had yellowed with age. Samuel opened it quickly and began turning through old notes collected during the investigation 20 years earlier. For several minutes he searched in silence. Then he stopped. His eyes widened. Eleanor stepped closer. What did you find? Samuel held the page beside the metal. The handwriting matched. Not perfectly. Age and time altered small details. But it matched enough. The same sharp letters. The same unusual spacing. The same hand. This came from Isaac Wren. Eleanor looked from the journal to the metal. You're sure? Samuel nodded slowly. As sure as I can be. Then he noticed something else. A name, buried inside one of the old witness statements. Not Isaac Wren. Not his wife. Another name entirely. Samuel read it twice. Then a third time. His face lost color. Eleanor saw the reaction immediately. What? The old Marshal lifted his eyes. The adoption wasn't random. The room fell silent. Caleb stared. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. Samuel looked toward the boy. Your father knew exactly who you were. The words landed like a hammer. Eleanor struggled to breathe. Daniel had always refused to discuss the night Caleb arrived. Every question ended the same way. Someday. Later. When he's older. Now Samuel was telling her the secret went deeper than protection. Deeper than kindness. Daniel had known something. Something important enough to hide for 8 years. Before anyone could speak again, a sound echoed outside. Not hoofbeats this time. Wheels. Wagon wheels. Fast. Samuel moved toward the window immediately. A freight wagon raced down the distant road toward the farm. The driver whipped the horses relentlessly. Even from a distance, the urgency was obvious. The wagon reached the yard minutes later. Deputy Walter Briggs practically jumped from the seat before it stopped moving. He stumbled toward the porch, carrying a folded document in one hand. His face looked pale. Worse than before. Much worse. Samuel met him at the door. Walter? The deputy struggled to catch his breath. Court order. Samuel frowned. Foreclosure? Walter shook his head. No. He handed over the paper. Custody. The word hit harder than a gunshot. Eleanor felt the room spin. Samuel opened the document and read quickly. Then, he cursed beneath his breath. The railroad attorneys had filed a petition claiming Caleb Carter was not legally connected to Eleanor Carter by blood. They demanded immediate review of guardianship rights. Pending investigation, county authorities were authorized to remove the child. Eleanor grabbed the paper from Samuel's hands. Her vision blurred as she read. She barely noticed Caleb standing beside her. They can't do this. Walter looked miserable. Kane owns half the judges in 3 counties. Samuel stared toward the darkening horizon. At last he understood. Victor Kane did not want the farm. He wanted the boy. The farm. The debt. The foreclosure. The humiliation. Every piece had been designed to lead here. And somewhere inside a 20-year-old mystery, a hidden name waited to explain why. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. Protection begins. The custody order remained on the table long after Deputy Walter Briggs left the farm. Nobody touched it. Nobody needed to. The paper seemed to carry its own weight, poisoning the atmosphere of the small cabin simply by existing. Eleanor Carter stood beside the stove staring at the document while Caleb sat near the window pretending to watch the falling snow. Neither spoke much. Fear had a way of exhausting conversation. The boy understood enough to know that someone wanted to separate him from the only mother he had ever known. Eleanor understood far more than she wished she did. For 8 years, she and Daniel had protected a secret without fully understanding its value. Now powerful men were willing to use courts, threats, and violence to reach it. Samuel Reed remained seated at the table with the military medal resting in front of him. The old Marshal studied the brass surface again and again. searching for something he might have missed. 20 years earlier, he failed to solve the disappearance of Isaac Wren. 20 years earlier, he allowed powerful men to bury a truth beneath paperwork, influence, and fear. The memory still haunted him. Yet, for the first time since arriving at the Carter farm, something felt different. The pieces were finally moving. Victor Kane had stopped hiding. Men only abandoned caution when they believed victory was close. That meant Kane thought he was winning. Samuel intended to prove him wrong. Outside, evening settled across the prairie. The isolated cabin stood alone against a sea of snow, while darkness slowly swallowed the horizon. Inside, Caleb eventually fell asleep beside the stove with a blanket pulled over his shoulders. Eleanor covered him carefully and stood watching for several moments before turning toward Samuel. "Tell me the truth," she said quietly. The old Marshal lifted his eyes. "About what? How much danger is he in?" Samuel glanced toward the sleeping boy. The answer was not simple. Enough that Kane is no longer pretending. Eleanor lowered her gaze. "Can they really take him?" Samuel looked toward the custody order. For several seconds he considered softening the truth. Then he decided against it. False hope rarely helped anyone. If Kane controls the court, yes. The widow sat heavily in a chair. Her face showed the exhaustion of years rather than days. "Then we've already lost." Samuel shook his head immediately. "No." The certainty surprised both of them. Eleanor looked up. "Why not?" Samuel picked up the medal and turned it beneath the lamp. The hidden inscription caught the light. "To my son, if anything happens to me, trust the name hidden beneath yours." The old Marshal traced the letters with his thumb. "Because Kane is afraid." Eleanor frowned. "Afraid of what?" Samuel looked toward Caleb. "The truth." The answer lingered between them. Deep down, both knew it was correct. Men like Victor Kane did not spend fortunes chasing ordinary children. They did not manipulate courts for no reason. Somewhere behind the mystery waited something valuable enough to terrify powerful people. Samuel slept very little that night. After Eleanor retired to the small bedroom, he remained at the table surrounded by old notebooks and weathered papers taken from his saddlebags. The fire burned low while snow drifted against the windows. Hour after hour, he reread every note connected to Isaac Wren's disappearance. Most led nowhere. Witness statements contradicted each other. Property records contained gaps. Names appeared and vanished. Yet shortly after midnight, he discovered something unusual. A railroad clerk's statement taken 20 years earlier described an argument between Isaac Wren and representatives connected to a land acquisition project. At the time, Samuel dismissed the detail because it seemed unrelated to the disappearance. Now it felt different. He studied the names attached to the report and immediately recognized one. The company involved eventually became part of Victor Kane's railroad empire. Samuel leaned back slowly. A coincidence remained possible. 2 coincidences became suspicious. 3 became a pattern. By dawn, he had filled several pages with notes linking Isaac Wren to disputed land purchases, railroad surveys, and expansion routes worth enormous amounts of money. Yet one question refused to leave him alone. If Isaac died because of land, why were men still hunting a child 20 years later? The answer remained hidden somewhere beyond his reach. Before sunrise, Samuel saddled his horse. Eleanor met him outside while pale winter light spread across the prairie. "Where are you going?" she asked. Samuel tightened a saddle strap. "Blackstone." "Why?" "Because answers don't appear on their own." Eleanor crossed her arms against the cold wind. "You think you'll find something?" Samuel looked toward the eastern horizon. "I think somebody buried something." The widow studied him for a moment. "And if you're wrong?" Samuel climbed into the saddle. "Then we're no worse off than we already are." Before riding away, he glanced toward the cabin. Caleb stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket. The boy raised a hand. Samuel nodded back. Strange how quickly responsibility could grow. Only 2 days earlier, he intended to leave Red Willow Crossing forever. Now he found himself riding toward danger because a child carrying an old medal needed someone willing to ask difficult questions. The journey to Blackstone consumed most of the day. The town stood larger than Red Willow Crossing, built around the railroad and swollen by years of commerce. Steam locomotives hissed beside crowded platforms, while freight wagons rolled through muddy streets. Samuel moved directly toward the county archives near the courthouse square. The elderly clerk inside recognized him immediately. She seemed surprised to see him, but not entirely displeased. After a brief conversation, she disappeared among towering shelves and returned carrying ledgers thick with dust. Samuel spent hours turning fragile pages beneath dim afternoon light. Property transfers, railroad contracts, court filings, tax records, hundreds of names blurred together. Then, shortly before sunset, he found something. A land deed dated 6 months before Isaac Wren disappeared. Samuel read it once, then again, then a third time. The property belonged to Isaac himself. The discovery made little sense. A cavalry officer owning land directly along a future railroad expansion route? The coincidence felt impossible. Samuel continued reading. More documents followed. Additional surveys, valuation reports, purchase offers. A pattern emerged slowly. Isaac Wren had acquired land that later became incredibly valuable after railroad engineers selected the route crossing it. Several companies attempted to purchase the property. Isaac refused. Samuel felt a chill run through him. At last he had motive. Not inheritance. Not revenge. Money. Vast amounts of money. Yet the answer only deepened the mystery. If Isaac died because of land disputes, why was Victor Kane desperately pursuing Caleb decades later? As he prepared to leave, the archive clerk returned carrying one final ledger. "You asked for everything connected to Wren," she said. Samuel nodded. She handed him the book. A folded document slipped free and landed on the table. The old Marshal opened it without thinking. Seconds later, he froze. Adoption records. Not the records themselves, but a note referencing them. His pulse quickened. Somebody had hidden the document among property filings. Deliberately, carefully, Samuel unfolded the page completely and read the message written across it. The actual adoption record has been relocated for the child's protection. Beneath the sentence appeared a signature, Daniel Carter. Samuel stared at the name in disbelief. The dead farmer had not merely protected a child. He had participated in protecting the secret itself. He knew exactly who Caleb was. He knew enough to hide official records. He knew enough to leave instructions for anyone who might one day discover them. Samuel slowly folded the paper and slipped it into his coat. Outside, darkness settled over Blackstone, while locomotive whistles echoed across the town. Inside the archive building, one realization became impossible to ignore. Daniel Carter had never been an accidental guardian. He had been chosen. And if that was true, then somewhere beyond the missing adoption records waited a truth powerful enough to terrify Victor Kane even 20 years later. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. The Villain Strikes Back. Samuel Reed left Blackstone long after sunset, with Daniel Carter's note hidden safely inside his coat, and a growing certainty that Victor Kane's interest in Caleb had very little to do with the farm itself. The prairie stretched endlessly beneath a moonlit sky while snow drifted across the road in silver waves. Most men would have waited until morning before attempting the journey home, but Samuel had spent too many years watching truth disappear because people moved too slowly. Every instinct told him that time was becoming dangerous. The discovery inside the archives changed the entire shape of the mystery. Daniel Carter had not stumbled into the role of guardian. He had been chosen. Someone trusted him with a child important enough to justify hidden records, false identities, and years of secrecy. The old Marshal replayed the realization repeatedly as his horse carried him north through the darkness. If Daniel knew the truth, then he almost certainly left more behind. Men willing to protect a secret for 8 years rarely relied on a single precaution. Somewhere inside that cabin, Samuel believed another piece of the puzzle was waiting. Back at the farm, Eleanor Carter spent the evening trying to create the illusion of normal life, despite knowing normality had already vanished. She prepared supper, added wood to the stove, and listened to Caleb describe a story Daniel once told him about a cavalry scout who survived a winter storm by following the stars. The conversation felt comforting for a few minutes, but eventually silence returned. It always did. Fear lived inside the cabin now. It sat beside them at meals. It followed them into sleep. It waited outside every window. Caleb finally looked up from the table and asked the question that had been growing inside him for days. Did Daniel know who I really was? Eleanor lowered her eyes. The answer seemed obvious now, yet speaking it aloud still hurt. I think he did. Caleb remained quiet for a moment. And you? Eleanor stared into the fire. Not everything. The boy nodded slowly. Then we're all looking for the same answers. The statement sounded far older than 8 years. Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Before she could respond, a faint sound drifted through the darkness outside. Hoofbeats. Fast. Determined. Both immediately looked toward the window. Relief arrived the instant Eleanor recognized the approaching rider. Samuel. Yet the relief vanished almost as quickly, because 3 more riders appeared behind him. Their horses pounded through the snow, while the distance between them steadily shrank. Samuel saw the cabin ahead and urged his horse forward. The riders behind him had followed since Blackstone. At first he suspected coincidence. Then they mirrored every turn, every stop, every change of pace. By the time he reached open prairie, certainty replaced doubt. Kane knew he had found something. The old Marshal reached the farm moments before the others. He swung from the saddle and moved toward the porch, while Eleanor stepped outside carrying Daniel's rifle. Caleb remained near the doorway. The pursuing riders finally stopped beyond the fence line, close enough to threaten but far enough to avoid easy retaliation. None appeared nervous. Their confidence disturbed Samuel immediately. The leader pulled his horse forward slightly and smiled. Marshal Reed. Samuel ignored the title. You're a long way from town. The rider shrugged. Mr. Kane likes to stay informed. The answer confirmed everything. Someone in Blackstone had reported Samuel's activities almost immediately. Kane's influence stretched farther than expected. The rider glanced toward the cabin. The widow should prepare herself. Eleanor tightened her grip on the rifle. For what? The man looked directly at her. Court officers arrive in 3 days. Samuel remained silent. The rider continued. The boy will be taken into state custody pending review. The words hung in the frozen air. Caleb heard every one of them. The rider knew he would. That was the point. Intimidation worked best when children could hear it. Tell Kane to come himself, Samuel said. The rider smiled again. He doesn't need to. Then the men turned their horses and rode away into the darkness without another threat. No shots, no violence, nothing dramatic. That frightened Samuel more than an attack would have. Men who expected victory rarely wasted effort proving they were dangerous. Once the riders disappeared, Samuel entered the cabin and immediately removed the folded note from his coat. He explained everything he discovered in Blackstone, the railroad records, Isaac Wren's land ownership, the connection to future expansion routes, most importantly, Daniel Carter's signature hidden among the adoption filings. Eleanor listened in silence. The more Samuel spoke, the more she realized how little Daniel had shared during his lifetime. Not because he distrusted her, because he was protecting her. The distinction hurt. Caleb sat quietly beside the stove, absorbing every word. The mystery that surrounded his life no longer felt distant. It was becoming personal. When Samuel finally finished, the boy looked toward the old Marshal and asked, "If Daniel knew all of this, why didn't he leave us anything?" The question settled over the room. Samuel considered it carefully. Then he looked around the cabin. Every board, every shelf, every corner. Maybe he did. The possibility changed the atmosphere instantly. Within minutes, all 3 began searching. Drawers were emptied, cabinets opened, boxes examined, loose floorboards checked, old trunks dragged into the center of the room. Hours passed while snow accumulated outside, yet nothing appeared. No letters, no maps, no records, no explanation. Eventually, frustration began replacing hope. Eleanor sat heavily in a chair and rubbed her tired eyes. Maybe there isn't anything. Samuel remained unconvinced. Daniel Carter struck him as the sort of man who prepared for consequences. Men who spent years hiding secrets usually planned for failure as well. The old Marshal continued searching long after common sense suggested stopping. Near midnight, Caleb climbed the ladder leading toward the loft where Daniel once stored tools and old supplies. He had searched the area earlier, but something continued bothering him. The memory surfaced unexpectedly. Years ago, Daniel always warned him never to climb onto the highest storage shelf because the wood there was unstable. At the time, the explanation seemed reasonable. Tonight it felt different. Caleb moved carefully across the loft and examined the shelf more closely. Dust covered everything. Broken harnesses, rusted tools, empty crates. Then he noticed one board darker than the others. Not newer. Merely handled more often. "Mama?" Eleanor looked up immediately. "What is it?" Caleb pointed toward the board. Samuel climbed the ladder and examined the area. Within seconds, he noticed the same thing. The timber shifted slightly when pressed. A hidden compartment. The old Marshal's pulse quickened. Carefully, he pulled the board free. A small tin box rested inside. Nothing else. The discovery silenced the room. Samuel carried the box down the ladder and placed it on the table. Eleanor moved closer. Caleb stood beside her. For a moment, nobody touched it. 8 years of secrets seemed concentrated inside a single weathered container. Finally, Samuel opened the lid. Inside rested 3 objects: a photograph, a folded railroad map, and a sealed letter. The photograph immediately captured their attention. It showed a younger Isaac Wren standing beside a woman and a small child. The boy could not have been older than 3. Around his neck hung the same military medal Caleb carried every day. Eleanor felt her breath catch. Caleb stared at the image without speaking. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Not identical. Not yet. But enough. Samuel slowly unfolded the railroad map. Several routes had been marked in red ink. One location appeared circled repeatedly. The same location connected to the disputed property records found in Blackstone. Then his attention shifted to the final item. The letter remained sealed. Across the front, written in Daniel Carter's unmistakable hand, were 6 simple words: "For Caleb when the time comes." The room fell silent. Outside, snow continued drifting across the prairie. Inside, the answers they had chased for years rested inside a sealed envelope. Yet Samuel could not shake a growing sense of unease. Because if Daniel expected Caleb to read the letter someday, then Daniel knew the truth would eventually surface. And if Daniel knew that, someone else may have known it too. Far beyond the farm, inside a warm office overlooking railroad tracks and freight yards, Victor Kane stared at a map spread across his desk while a trusted messenger delivered news from the Carter farm. The railroad boss listened quietly until the report ended. Then he smiled. Not because he was winning, because events were finally moving according to schedule. "Keep watching them," he said. The messenger nodded. "Do you think they've found it?" Kane looked toward the dark window. "I think they're about to." The messenger hesitated. "And the boy?" Victor Kane's expression hardened. "Make sure he reaches the hearing." The answer sounded strange enough that the messenger frowned. Most men would have demanded the child be stopped. Victor Kane wanted the opposite. He wanted Caleb alive, present, visible. The reason remained hidden. But for the first time since this began, one truth became clear. Victor Kane was not trying to prevent the secret from emerging. He was waiting for the right moment to use it. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. The secret revealed. For several long moments after discovering the tin box, nobody spoke. The photograph, the railroad map, and Daniel Carter's sealed letter rested beneath the glow of the oil lamp while snow whispered against the cabin walls outside. Caleb could not take his eyes off the photograph. The little boy standing beside Isaac Wren wore the same military medal hanging around his own neck. The resemblance was no longer something that could be explained away by coincidence. It stared directly back at him from the faded image. Eleanor stood beside him with one hand resting gently on his shoulder, as though afraid he might somehow disappear if she let go. Samuel Reed remained seated at the table studying the sealed envelope. Years of experience told him that answers often arrived alongside new dangers. Daniel Carter had hidden the box for a reason. Whatever waited inside the letter was important enough to remain buried for 8 years, and perhaps dangerous enough to destroy lives if revealed carelessly. Yet there was no turning back now. Too many people were already moving. Victor Kane was tightening his grip. The court hearing approached. Men were following them. Secrets protected by silence had finally reached the point where silence itself became a threat. Caleb was the one who broke the stillness. "It says it's for me." Samuel looked up. The boy's eyes remained fixed on the envelope. "Yes." Caleb swallowed hard. Then I should open it. Nobody disagreed. The old Marshal carefully placed the letter in front of him. Caleb hesitated only a second before breaking the seal. The paper inside had yellowed with age. Daniel's handwriting filled both sides of the page. The boy recognized it immediately. The sight alone brought tears to his eyes. For a brief moment, it felt as though Daniel was sitting beside him again. Caleb took a slow breath and began reading aloud. Daniel's words were simple, honest, direct. He wrote that if Caleb was reading the letter, then the secret could no longer remain hidden. He apologized for the years of silence and explained that every lie had been told out of love rather than shame. He wrote that Caleb had been brought to the farm during a winter storm by a dying woman named Margaret Wren. She carried him through snow and darkness, after men tried to kill them both. Before dying, she revealed the truth. Caleb was not Caleb Carter. His birth name was Caleb Wren. He was the son of Isaac Wren. The room became completely silent. Even though Samuel suspected the answer for days, hearing it spoken aloud felt different. Real. Permanent. Caleb stared at the page while his hands trembled slightly. Eleanor closed her eyes. Part of her always knew this moment would arrive. She simply never imagined it would hurt so much. The letter continued. Daniel explained that Isaac Wren discovered evidence proving several railroad investors were secretly acquiring land through fraud and intimidation. The scheme involved local officials, businessmen, and wealthy investors. Among the names Isaac intended to expose was a young railroad executive named Victor Kane. Before Isaac could bring the evidence forward, his family was attacked. Margaret escaped with Caleb and the medal. Daniel promised her he would hide the boy and raise him as his own. He kept that promise until the day he died. The revelation settled over the cabin like a storm. Caleb lowered the letter slowly. For several moments, nobody spoke. The boy's entire life had shifted in the space of a few paragraphs. The father he loved remained his father. Nothing could change that. Yet another identity now stood beside the one he had always known. Another family, another history, another future. Samuel watched him carefully. Children often handled truth better than adults expected. The pain came later when they understood the consequences. Eleanor finally sat beside him and took his hand. "You are still my son." Caleb nodded immediately. Tears filled his eyes. "I know." The answer relieved her more than she expected. Samuel looked back toward the letter. There was more, much more. Daniel described another discovery made shortly before his death. The disputed land connected to Isaac Wren's railroad investigation had never been legally transferred. Hidden inside old legal agreements was a clause naming Isaac's direct heir as beneficiary if ownership was ever challenged successfully in court. Samuel felt his pulse quicken. He already knew where this was leading. Caleb continued reading. The heir was Caleb Wren. The farm. The railroad route. The disputed property. The fortune connected to it. Everything belonged to him. Not immediately, not automatically, but legally. The room fell silent again. At last the pieces fit together. Victor Kane was not trying to erase Caleb because of the past. He was trying to control him because of the future. If Caleb's identity became public and the inheritance claim succeeded, decades of fraudulent ownership could collapse overnight. Entire railroad investments might be challenged. Land claims could be overturned. Fortunes could disappear. Samuel finally understood why Kane looked terrified the moment he saw the medal. The discovery should have brought relief. Instead, it brought new fear. Because proving the truth would be far more difficult than learning it. Daniel's letter provided testimony. The photograph provided evidence. The medal connected Caleb to Isaac Wren. Yet powerful men rarely surrendered simply because truth existed. They fought harder. They lied louder. They bought more influence. Samuel knew exactly what Victor Kane would do next. The railroad boss could not allow this information to reach the court hearing, which meant Kane would almost certainly act before then. The old Marshal stood and moved toward the window. Dawn remained hours away, yet unease settled heavily inside him. Something felt wrong, too quiet, too calm, almost as though a storm was gathering beyond sight. His instincts proved correct moments later when a horse appeared outside the cabin. Deputy Walter Briggs rode into the yard at full speed. He barely slowed before jumping from the saddle. Samuel opened the door before the deputy reached the porch. One look at Walter's face told him the news was bad. Very bad. What happened? The deputy struggled to catch his breath. The courthouse. Samuel frowned. What about it? Walter looked directly at him. The records room burned down. Silence followed. Samuel felt his stomach drop immediately. Accident? The deputy shook his head. No. The answer was expected. Yet hearing it aloud made everything worse. Walter continued. Most of the old property records are gone. Eleanor stepped closer. Including Isaac Wren's files? The deputy nodded grimly. Most likely. Samuel closed his eyes briefly. Cain had moved faster than expected. The fire was not about revenge. It was about evidence. Destroy the records. Destroy the history. Destroy the claim. The railroad boss was no longer defending himself. He was actively preparing for war. Then Walter revealed the final piece of news. There's something else. Samuel looked up. What? The deputy hesitated. Judge Holloway moved the hearing forward. The old marshal stared. How far? Walter swallowed. Tomorrow morning. The room fell completely silent. Tomorrow. Not next week. Not 3 days. Tomorrow. Cain knew the truth was surfacing. He was accelerating everything before more evidence could emerge. Caleb looked down at Daniel's letter resting on the table. Only hours earlier he believed he was an ordinary farm boy. Now he was the center of a battle involving hidden identities, stolen fortunes, and a 20-year conspiracy. Outside, the wind howled across the prairie, while darkness pressed against the windows. Inside the cabin, Samuel Reed stared at the letter and understood something that frightened him more than the courthouse fire. Victor Cain was no longer trying to delay the truth. He was preparing to bury it forever. And if they failed at tomorrow's hearing, Caleb Wren might lose not only his inheritance, but his freedom as well. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Sacrifice. Nobody slept after Deputy Walter Briggs delivered the news. The courthouse records had been destroyed. The hearing had been moved forward. By sunrise, Caleb Wren would stand before a judge controlled by men determined to erase the truth before it could fully emerge. The small cabin felt colder than usual despite the fire burning inside the stove. Daniel Carter's letter remained open on the table beside the photograph, the railroad map, and the military medal that had started everything. For years, the secret remained hidden beneath layers of lies and silence. Now that the truth finally stood in the open, powerful men were moving faster than ever to destroy it. Samuel Reed sat alone near the window while Eleanor and Caleb rested briefly in the adjoining room. The retired marshal had spent most of his life believing courage meant facing danger. Age taught him something different. Courage often meant accepting consequences. The realization settled heavily upon him as he stared into the darkness outside. 20 years earlier, he failed Isaac Wren. He failed to uncover the conspiracy. He failed to protect a family. He failed to stop powerful men from rewriting history. For 2 decades, he carried that failure everywhere he went. The weight never truly disappeared. Now fate had delivered him one final chance. Yet Samuel understood something the others did not. Victor Cain would never allow the hearing to proceed fairly. The railroad boss had already burned records. He had already manipulated judges. He had already threatened witnesses. Tomorrow would not be a legal proceeding. It would be a battlefield disguised as a courtroom. Before dawn, Samuel quietly stepped outside. Snow covered the prairie beneath a pale moon while freezing wind swept across the open land. He saddled his horse without making noise and removed a folded bundle of papers from inside his coat. The documents included the original note from Blackstone, copies of land records, witness statements from his old investigation, and everything connecting Caleb Wren to Isaac Wren. If Cain's men intercepted them, the hearing would be lost before it began. Samuel stood beside the horse for several moments, staring toward the distant horizon. Then he made a decision. A difficult one. A necessary one. He mounted the horse and rode away from the farm alone. An hour later, Eleanor woke and immediately noticed Samuel was gone. Panic rose inside her chest when she discovered the empty chair and missing horse. She rushed outside, only to find fresh tracks leading south across the snow. Caleb followed moments later. The boy understood the truth before she did. Samuel had left. The realization felt like betrayal at first. After everything that happened, After finally choosing to help, the retired marshal had disappeared on the most important day. Eleanor felt anger rising. Then she noticed the envelope resting on the table where Samuel had been sitting. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside waited a short message written in the old marshal's handwriting. He explained that Kane expected them to travel directly to court. Kane expected the evidence to travel with them. Kane expected to stop both. Samuel intended to make sure at least one of those assumptions proved wrong. Eleanor read the letter twice before lowering it slowly. Caleb looked up at her. "What does it say?" She swallowed hard. "It says he's drawing them away from us." Silence filled the room. Both understood what that meant. Samuel had deliberately made himself the target. The old marshal rode hard across the prairie while dawn slowly brightened the eastern sky. The evidence remained hidden inside his saddlebags. He knew Kane's men would follow eventually. In truth, he was counting on it. Around mid-morning, he spotted them. 4 riders appeared behind him in the distance. Then 6. Then more. Samuel smiled grimly. Kane had taken the bait. The railroad boss clearly believed the evidence remained with him. That assumption would buy Eleanor and Caleb valuable time. The old marshal pushed his horse harder. Snow exploded beneath pounding hooves while the riders behind him gradually closed the distance. He no longer rode toward Blackstone. Instead, he angled west toward a narrow canyon known locally as Dry Hawk Pass. The terrain offered cover. More importantly, it offered delays. Samuel knew every trail, ridge, and crossing in the region. Years as a lawman taught him how to disappear when necessary. Yet even he understood the odds. He was old. They were many. Eventually, the chase would end. The question was whether it would end late enough. Meanwhile, Eleanor and Caleb prepared for the hearing. Deputy Briggs arrived shortly after sunrise with a wagon and 2 trusted ranchers willing to help. None possessed wealth or influence. What they possessed was character. Sometimes that mattered more. As the wagon rolled toward Blackstone, Caleb sat quietly beside his mother holding Daniel's letter. The boy's life had transformed beyond recognition in a matter of days. Yet beneath the confusion and fear, something stronger had begun taking root. Determination. Daniel raised him well. Eleanor saw it in the way he sat straighter, in the way he asked questions rather than hiding from answers, in the way he carried the medal openly now, instead of keeping it hidden beneath his coat. The child Victor Kane wanted erased was slowly becoming someone capable of standing against him. Hours later, Samuel reached Dry Hawk Pass. The canyon walls rose sharply on both sides while snow gathered among rocks and scrub brush. The old marshal guided his horse through a narrow section and finally stopped. The riders pursuing him would arrive soon. Very soon. Samuel dismounted and removed the saddlebags. Then he smiled. The bags contained no evidence at all. Hours earlier, he secretly handed every important document to Deputy Briggs. The chase had always been a deception. Kane's men were risking everything for empty leather sacks. The thought pleased him more than it should have. Moments later, the first riders entered the canyon. Samuel calmly waited beside his horse. The lead rider recognized him immediately. "Where are the papers?" Samuel shrugged. "Gone." The man dismounted. "You expect us to believe that?" Samuel smiled faintly. "I don't much care what you believe." The rider's face darkened. More men arrived behind him. 7 in total. The odds were impossible. Samuel knew it. They knew it. Yet something unexpected happened. The old marshal felt peaceful. For the first time in 20 years, he was no longer running from failure. He was confronting it. The riders searched the saddlebags. Empty. Their anger grew immediately. Questions became threats. Threats became violence. Samuel endured it without speaking. Every minute they wasted in the canyon was another minute Eleanor and Caleb moved closer to the courthouse. Another minute Victor Kane remained blind. Another minute truth stayed alive. By the time the riders realized they had been deceived, precious hours were gone. The leader mounted his horse and cursed furiously. The hearing. Samuel laughed through split lips. "Now you're finally thinking." The riders abandoned him and raced back toward Blackstone. The old marshal watched them disappear before slowly lowering himself against a rock. Pain radiated through his body. Blood stained the snow beside him. Yet despite everything, he smiled. because he had succeeded. Kane's men followed the wrong trail. The evidence remained untouched. The hearing would happen. Whether they won or lost no longer depended on luck. It depended on truth. Far away, the courthouse bell rang noon across Blackstone. Citizens gathered inside and outside the building. Ranchers, merchants, railroad workers, town officials, curious families. Word had spread quickly. A wealthy railroad boss, a mysterious child, a disputed inheritance. Public conflict always attracted attention. Inside the crowded courtroom, Victor Kane sat confidently beside his attorneys. Eleanor and Caleb entered moments later, accompanied by Deputy Briggs. The railroad boss immediately noticed one thing: Samuel Reed was not with them. A faint smile appeared on Kane's face. He believed the old Marshal had failed. He believed the evidence had been intercepted. He believed victory was already secured. What Victor Kane did not know was that Samuel Reed's sacrifice had bought exactly what they needed: a chance. And sometimes a single chance was enough to change history. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. Au final confrontation. The courtroom in Blackstone had never held so many people. Long before the hearing began, townsfolk crowded the benches, lined the walls, and gathered outside the open doors, hoping to hear every word. Stories had spread quickly across the territory. A powerful railroad boss, a struggling single mother, a mysterious military medal, a hidden heir. Most people arrived expecting drama. Very few understood they were about to witness the collapse of a lie that had survived for 20 years. Eleanor Carter sat beside Caleb near the front of the courtroom, while Deputy Walter Briggs remained close by. The boy wore the medal openly around his neck now. For the first time in his life, he was no longer hiding it. Across the room, Victor Kane sat beside two attorneys dressed in expensive black coats. Confidence radiated from him. He believed Samuel Reed had failed. He believed the evidence had been intercepted. Most importantly, he believed Caleb Wren would leave the courthouse under state custody before the day ended. The judge entered moments later, and the room gradually fell silent. Judge Holloway wasted little time. He announced the purpose of the hearing, reviewed the custody petition, and invited Victor Kane's attorneys to begin. They moved quickly, presenting Eleanor as an unfit guardian whose legal connection to the child remained uncertain. They emphasized missing records, missing documentation, missing proof. Every argument pointed toward the same conclusion. Caleb's identity could not be verified. Therefore, temporary custody should be transferred pending further investigation. The logic sounded reasonable to anyone unfamiliar with the truth. That was exactly why Kane paid for it. Eleanor listened in silence while the attorneys spoke. Every accusation felt carefully prepared. Every statement seemed designed to exploit the destruction of the courthouse records. Samuel had been right. This was never a fair hearing. It was an execution disguised as procedure. Eventually, the attorneys finished. Victor Kane remained calm, occasionally exchanging quiet words with his legal team. He looked entirely comfortable. The railroad boss expected the next phase to unfold exactly as planned. Then Judge Holloway turned toward Eleanor. "Do you wish to respond?" The widow rose slowly. For a brief moment, nervousness threatened to overwhelm her. She was not a lawyer. She was not wealthy. She was not powerful. She was simply a mother fighting for her child. Then she looked down at Caleb and remembered every cold night, every sacrifice, every year spent protecting him. Strength returned immediately. Eleanor placed Daniel Carter's letter on the evidence table. The room grew quiet. "My husband left this before he died." One attorney immediately stood. "Objection. Unverified personal correspondence." The judge hesitated. Victor Kane smiled. Then Deputy Walter Briggs rose from his seat. "The letter directly addresses the child's identity." The courtroom stirred. Judge Holloway finally nodded. "Proceed." Eleanor opened the letter and began reading. Daniel's words echoed throughout the room. He described the winter storm, Margaret Wren's arrival, the dying mother's plea, the child she carried, the promise he made. The truth unfolded piece by piece. Every sentence tightened the atmosphere. Every revelation weakened Victor Kane's confidence. The railroad boss stopped smiling entirely when Eleanor reached the part identifying Caleb as the son of Isaac Wren. Murmurs spread across the courtroom. The judge struck his gavel repeatedly for silence. Yet the damage was already done. People were listening now, truly listening. Victor Kane's attorney quickly moved to dismiss the letter as hearsay. Under ordinary circumstances, the argument might have worked. Then Caleb stepped forward. Nobody expected it. Not the judge, not Eleanor, not even Kane. The boy removed the military medal from around his neck and placed it on the table. The brass surface caught the afternoon light. Several older residents immediately recognized it. Some whispered Isaac Wren's name before realizing they had spoken aloud. Caleb's voice remained steady despite his age. "This belonged to my father." Silence followed. He continued, "Not Daniel Carter." The room remained perfectly still. Isaac Wren. The boy then revealed the hidden inscription. Samuel Reed had already documented it before leaving. Deputy Briggs presented the written copy to the court. The message was read aloud. "To my son, if anything happens to me, trust the name hidden beneath yours." The words struck the room like thunder. Even Judge Holloway looked unsettled. The inscription transformed the medal from a keepsake into evidence. Victor Kane's attorneys immediately objected again, but their confidence had begun to crack. Too many pieces were aligning. Too many coincidences were becoming facts. Then came the moment Victor Kane feared most. Deputy Briggs presented copies of the property records Samuel discovered in Blackstone, not the originals. Kane had destroyed many of those through fire, but copies survived elsewhere. Survey maps, ownership filings, railroad agreements. Each document connected Isaac Wren to land that later became extraordinarily valuable. More importantly, each document established motive. Samuel's investigation, preserved inside old notebooks and witness statements, was introduced next. The retired Marshal was absent, yet his work filled the room. Names surfaced, transactions surfaced, secret agreements surfaced. For the first time in 2 decades, the conspiracy surrounding Isaac Wren stood exposed before the public. Kane's attorneys fought desperately. They challenged authenticity. They challenged timelines. They challenged witnesses. Yet every challenge seemed weaker than the one before it. Truth possesses a unique quality. Once enough of it accumulates, denial begins to sound ridiculous. Victor Kane finally stood. The railroad boss had remained silent throughout most of the hearing, allowing attorneys to fight on his behalf. Now, he spoke directly. "This is speculation." His voice remained controlled, but anger simmered beneath the surface. Stories told by dead men and desperate people. The courtroom listened carefully. Kane pointed toward Caleb. "That child is being manipulated." Eleanor immediately rose, but the judge signaled for silence. Kane continued, "You have no proof he is Isaac Wren's son." For a moment it appeared he might recover control. Then a new voice interrupted from the rear of the courtroom. "Actually, they do." Every head turned. The doors opened. A figure stepped inside, supported by a cane and covered in dust, snow, and dried blood. Samuel Reed. The retired marshal looked exhausted, bruised, and barely standing. Yet his eyes remained clear. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Victor Kane's face lost color. Samuel slowly approached the front while Deputy Briggs helped him remain upright. "Marshal Reed," Judge Holloway said, "are you able to testify?" Samuel nodded. "I am." Then he placed a weathered ledger on the evidence table. The book came from Dry Hawk Pass, hidden inside the canyon years earlier by Isaac Wren himself. Samuel discovered it after escaping Kane's riders. The ledger contained names, payments, land transfers, bribes. Every major figure connected to the conspiracy appeared within its pages, including Victor Kane. Most devastating of all, the final section contained a sworn statement written by Isaac Wren before his disappearance. In that statement, he identified his son by name, Caleb Wren. The courtroom fell silent. Complete silence. No objections followed. No arguments emerged. Even Kane's attorneys understood the battle was finished. Judge Holloway spent nearly an hour reviewing the evidence. Nobody left. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Finally, the judge returned his attention to the courtroom. His expression looked grim. This court finds that substantial evidence supports the identity of Caleb Wren as the legal heir of Isaac Wren. Murmurs swept through the crowd. The judge continued. The custody petition is dismissed immediately. Eleanor closed her eyes. Relief hit so hard, it nearly stole her balance. Caleb gripped her hand. Tears filled his eyes. Yet the judge was not finished. He turned toward Victor Kane. Copies of this evidence will be transferred to territorial authorities for criminal review. The railroad boss stood abruptly. Panic finally replaced confidence. You cannot. The judge struck the gavel. I can. Kane looked around the room desperately. For the first time, influence failed him. Money failed him. Fear failed him. The crowd no longer saw a powerful businessman. They saw a man exposed. Several deputies moved toward him. Victor Kane understood immediately. The game was over. As deputies escorted the railroad boss from the courtroom, he turned once toward Caleb. Hatred flashed across his face. Then something else appeared. Regret. Not regret for his crimes. Regret that he had failed. Caleb watched silently as the man disappeared through the doors. 20 years of lies walked out with him. Outside, the church bell began ringing across Blackstone. People poured into the streets carrying news faster than any newspaper ever could. Justice had finally arrived. Yet inside the courtroom, Samuel Reed lowered himself into a chair and closed his eyes briefly. The battle was won. The truth was public. Caleb was safe. But one final chapter still remained. Because victory and healing were not the same thing. And for the first time in many years, healing finally felt possible. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. Healing. The storm that had dominated their lives for so many years did not end with applause inside a courtroom. Real healing rarely arrived that way. It came quietly, one day at a time, like sunlight returning after a long winter. 3 weeks after the hearing in Blackstone, snow still covered parts of the prairie, but the harshest cold had begun to retreat. The Carter farm looked different now. Not richer, not grander, simply alive again. Neighbors who once avoided involvement while Victor Kane controlled the region now appeared almost daily carrying lumber, tools, livestock feed, and willing hands. Some came because they felt guilty for remaining silent. Others came because they genuinely cared. Most came because the truth had reminded them who they wanted to be. The damaged fences were repaired. The barn roof was rebuilt. Fields abandoned during months of uncertainty slowly returned to life. Eleanor Carter stood on the porch one morning, watching several men straighten fence posts beneath a bright blue sky. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond survival. The feeling remained unfamiliar. Yet it was welcome. The legal consequences spread quickly after the hearing. Territorial investigators arrived within days. Victor Kane's business records were seized. Several associates attempted to flee. Others cooperated in exchange for leniency. Hidden transactions emerged from ledgers once believed destroyed. Fraud. Bribery. Illegal land acquisitions. Witness intimidation. The empire Kane spent decades building began collapsing piece by piece beneath the weight of its own corruption. People throughout the territory spoke of the downfall as though it happened overnight. Samuel Reed knew better. The collapse started 20 years earlier when Isaac Wren chose honesty instead of silence. Truth simply required time to finish its work. News of the investigations reached the farm regularly. Eleanor listened politely whenever visitors shared updates, but she found herself caring less about Victor Kane with each passing day. Her attention belonged elsewhere. To the farm. To Caleb. To the life they almost lost. Caleb's adjustment proved more complicated. The boy carried two identities now. Caleb Carter. Caleb Wren. One represented the life he remembered. The other represented a past he never knew. At first he struggled with the contradiction. Some mornings he sat on the fence overlooking the pasture and stared at the metal hanging around his neck, as though expecting it to explain everything. Samuel noticed. One afternoon he joined the boy beneath a cottonwood tree overlooking the fields. Neither spoke immediately. The old Marshal understood that some conversations needed space before words could help. Eventually Caleb looked up. "Do you think my father would have liked me?" Samuel smiled faintly. "Which one?" The boy considered the question. Then he smiled too. Both. The answer pleased the old marshal more than he expected. He leaned back against the tree and looked across the prairie. Daniel Carter loved you enough to spend 8 years protecting you. Caleb nodded. Samuel continued. Isaac Wren died trying to make sure men like Victor Kane couldn't steal your future. The boy remained silent. Sounds to me like both of them liked you just fine. Caleb stared toward the horizon for a long moment, then he laughed softly. It was the first truly carefree laugh Samuel had heard from him since the entire ordeal began. The sound felt like victory. As spring approached, another surprise arrived. The disputed land connected to Isaac Wren's inheritance was finally returned through a settlement approved by territorial authorities. The value was substantial, far greater than anything Eleanor ever imagined possessing. Yet the first decision she made after receiving the news revealed exactly why the community respected her. She refused to leave the farm. Wealth offered opportunities, but it could not replace home. Daniel built that farm. Caleb grew up there. Every fence post carried memories. Every field contained part of their story. Instead of moving away, Eleanor invested in the property. New livestock arrived. Equipment was repaired. Additional acreage was purchased from struggling neighbors at fair prices rather than desperate ones. Gradually, the farm transformed into one of the strongest operations in the region, not because Eleanor chased wealth, because she understood responsibility. People noticed. Respect followed naturally. Samuel Reed recovered more slowly than anyone admitted aloud. The injuries he suffered in Dryhawk Pass lingered. Age made healing difficult. Yet every few days he appeared at the farm anyway. Sometimes he helped repair fences. Sometimes he shared stories from his years as a marshal. Sometimes he simply sat on the porch drinking coffee while watching the sunrise. One evening, several months after the hearing, Eleanor found him doing exactly that. The prairie glowed gold beneath the setting sun while distant cattle moved like shadows across the hills. She handed him a fresh cup and sat beside him. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, Samuel broke the silence. I almost walked away. Eleanor looked toward him. The old marshal stared at the horizon. Back when this started. She nodded. I know. Samuel smiled sadly. I told myself I was too old, too tired, that it wasn't my fight anymore. The widow considered his words carefully. Maybe it wasn't. Samuel looked confused. Eleanor continued. Maybe it became your fight the moment you chose it. The old marshal laughed quietly. That sounds like something Daniel would have said. They sat together in comfortable silence after that. Some wounds healed because justice arrived. Others healed because people forgave themselves. The final piece of healing arrived unexpectedly one autumn afternoon nearly a year after the hearing. Caleb returned from town carrying a small package addressed to him personally. The handwriting on the label was unfamiliar. Curious, he opened it at the kitchen table while Eleanor watched. Inside rested a leather-bound journal recovered during the investigation into Victor Kane's business records. Tucked inside the front cover was a note from territorial authorities explaining that the journal belonged to Isaac Wren and had been stored among confiscated evidence. Caleb opened the first page carefully. The entries began years before his birth. Stories, observations, hopes, dreams, the ordinary thoughts of a father. Tears filled the boy's eyes as he turned page after page. Near the end, he found a final unfinished entry written only days before Isaac disappeared. The words were simple. If anything happens to me, I hope my son grows up knowing he was loved every day of his life. Caleb read the sentence twice, then a third time. Finally, he closed the journal and looked toward Eleanor. She already knew what he wanted to say. The boy crossed the room and embraced her tightly. I did, he whispered. Eleanor closed her eyes. I know. In that moment, the distance between Caleb Carter and Caleb Wren disappeared completely. Both names belonged to him. Both fathers belonged to him. Both legacies belonged to him. Years later, people throughout the territory would still tell the story. They spoke about the railroad boss who fell, the retired marshal who returned to fight one last battle, the hidden heir whose identity changed everything. Yet those who truly understood the story always focused on something else. A single mother who refused to surrender her child, a promise kept through hardship and fear, a family formed not by blood alone but by choice. On quiet evenings, When the sun dipped below the prairie and painted the sky in gold and crimson, travelers passing the Carter farm often saw three figures sitting together on the porch. Eleanor, Caleb, Samuel. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they simply watched the horizon. Peace does not erase pain, it gives pain somewhere gentle to rest. After years of secrets, loss, and struggle, that was what finally settled over the farm. Not wealth, not victory, peace. And for the first time in a very long while, it stayed. End of chapter 10. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments what moment stayed with you the most. Was it Daniel Carter's sacrifice, Samuel Reed's final act of courage, or Caleb discovering the truth about who he really was? Stories like these remind us that kindness, courage, and integrity still matter, even when the world feels unfair. If you enjoy emotional cowboy stories filled with mystery, justice, and hope, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next journey across the American frontier. Thank you for spending this time with us. And until the next story, may the road rise gently beneath your feet, and may hope always find its way home.